Welcome to Framework, the podcast that makes the NIST cybersecurity framework practical, engaging, and accessible. Whether you're a cybersecurity professional, business leader, or simply curious about how organizations defend against cyber threats, this series is for you. This podcast is inspired by a comprehensive guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, a best-selling resource written by cybersecurity expert Dr. Jason Edwards and trusted by professionals worldwide. In each episode, we'll leverage a few insights from Jason's extensive book to dive deep into CSF 2.0, unpacking every function, category, and subcategory with real-world applications you can immediately use. If you're enjoying this episode and want to learn more, head over to cyberauthor.me to grab your copy of the book and access additional resources to enhance your cybersecurity journey. You can also visit baremetalcyber.com, where over 2 million people last year explored expert insights, articles, and practical tools across a wide range of cybersecurity topics. GV.OC-05 Cybersecurity Supply Chain Risk is managed. GV.OC-05 ensures that organizations identify, assess, and mitigate cybersecurity risks associated with their supply chain, including third-party vendors, service providers, and external business partners. This subcategory belongs to the govern function within the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework, version 2.0, emphasizing that supply chain security is critical to protecting business operations, data integrity, and service continuity. Without structured supply chain risk management, organizations face increased exposure to cyber threats originating from third-party vulnerabilities, unvetted software, and insecure vendor practices, leading to data breaches, financial losses, and regulatory non-compliance. Managing cybersecurity supply chain risk ensures that organizations implement security controls, enforce contractual obligations, and conduct ongoing risk assessments to prevent cyber threats from propagating through external dependencies. Supply chain attacks have become a significant cybersecurity threat as adversaries exploit weaknesses in vendor security, third-party access points, and unprotected software components to gain unauthorized access to enterprise networks. Organizations that enforce supply chain security policies, validate vendor security postures, and establish continuous monitoring mechanisms reduce their overall risk exposure, strengthen resilience, and prevent cybercriminals from infiltrating their systems through compromised suppliers. Multiple stakeholders are responsible for managing cybersecurity supply chain risks. Procurement and vendor management teams oversee contract negotiations, vendor onboarding processes, and compliance with security requirements, ensuring that third parties follow established cybersecurity standards. Cybersecurity and risk management teams conduct supplier risk assessments, monitor vendor security incidents, and implement access controls for third-party integrations, preventing unauthorized system access and data breaches. Legal and compliance teams ensure that vendor contracts include cybersecurity clauses, liability provisions, and data protection requirements, holding external suppliers accountable for meeting security expectations. Cybersecurity supply chain risk is managed through vendor risk assessments, security audits, contractual security obligations, and continuous threat monitoring. This includes implementing third-party security questionnaires, monitoring vendor activity for suspicious behavior, and requiring vendors to adhere to cybersecurity best practices such as secure coding, encryption, and access control policies. Organizations that fail to manage supply chain cybersecurity risks face increased exposure to ransomware attacks, software supply chain compromises, and unauthorized access to sensitive business information, undermining their operational security and regulatory compliance efforts. Several key terms define cybersecurity supply chain risk management and its role in enterprise security. Third-party risk management, TPRM, is the process of assessing, monitoring, and mitigating cybersecurity risks associated with external vendors, suppliers, and business partners. Software Bill of Materials, SBOM, is an inventory of all software components, dependencies, and libraries used in applications, ensuring organizations can track vulnerabilities and prevent supply chain attacks. Vendor security due diligence involves evaluating a supplier's cybersecurity posture before onboarding them as a business partner, ensuring that their security practices align with organizational risk requirements. Least privilege access control restricts vendor access to only the resources necessary for their business functions, reducing the attack surface and limiting third-party security risks. Continuous vendor security monitoring ensures that organizations track and assess vendor security postures in real time, detecting anomalous activities, security incidents, and potential breaches. Misconceptions about cybersecurity supply chain risk management often lead to weak vendor security oversight, poor enforcement of security controls, and increased third-party cyber risks. One common issue is assuming that vendors are solely responsible for their own cybersecurity risks, without recognizing that organizations are ultimately accountable for securing their supply chain and protecting shared data. Another issue is failing to conduct ongoing security assessments of vendors, leading organizations to onboard third parties without verifying their security posture, exposing them to ransomware threats, insecure software, and compliance failures. Some organizations mistakenly believe that third-party security risks are limited to large vendors, ignoring the fact that small suppliers, cloud service providers, and software developers also pose significant cybersecurity risks. When organizations effectively manage cybersecurity supply chain risks, they strengthen third-party security accountability, prevent supply chain attacks, and ensure compliance with data protection regulations. A well-structured cybersecurity supply chain risk management program ensures that all vendors, service providers, and contractors adhere to security best practices, reducing the risk of cybercriminals exploiting third-party vulnerabilities. Organizations that implement continuous vendor security assessments, enforce contractual cybersecurity requirements, and monitor third-party risk exposure establish a resilient supply chain security posture that minimizes cyber risks and enhances long-term business security. Organizations that fail to manage cybersecurity supply chain risks face significant security, operational, and regulatory consequences. Without structured supply chain security policies, organizations may unknowingly onboard vendors with poor security practices, increasing the likelihood of data breaches, ransomware infections, and unauthorized access through third-party systems. A common risk is insufficient vendor security oversight, where organizations fail to monitor third-party security postures and allow unverified suppliers to integrate with enterprise systems, exposing critical infrastructure and sensitive data to cyber threats. Another issue is lack of supply chain visibility, where organizations do not track software dependencies, cloud services, or external contractors, making it difficult to detect security vulnerabilities and prevent supply chain attacks. By implementing robust cybersecurity supply chain risk management practices, organizations can prevent cyber threats from infiltrating their networks through third-party weaknesses, ensure vendor accountability, and strengthen overall security resilience. When cybersecurity risks are factored into vendor selection, procurement processes, and ongoing supplier relationships, organizations can reduce third-party risk exposure, prevent unauthorized data access, and enforce compliance with regulatory security requirements. Organizations that conduct periodic vendor security audits, require adherence to cybersecurity policies, and enforce third-party security monitoring ensure that their supply chain is resilient, secure, and protected against emerging cyber threats. At the partial tier, organizations lack structured vendor security assessments, allowing third-party vendors to access enterprise networks without security vetting or contractual cybersecurity obligations. Risk management efforts are reactive, and vendor security policies are either informal or non-existent. A small business at this level may onboard a cloud service provider without reviewing its security posture, exposing sensitive customer data to unauthorized access or potential data leaks. At the risk-informed tier, organizations begin to establish basic supply chain security requirements, ensuring that some vendor security assessments are conducted before onboarding third parties. However, vendor risk evaluations may still be limited in scope, and organizations may lack real-time visibility into third-party security risks. A mid-sized retailer at this level may require basic security questionnaires for vendors, but fail to conduct in-depth risk assessments or enforce continuous vendor security monitoring, leaving the organization vulnerable to supply chain attacks. At the repeatable tier, organizations implement structured vendor security risk management frameworks, ensuring that all third-party suppliers undergo formal security reviews, adhere to contractual cybersecurity obligations, and are continuously monitored for compliance. Risk assessments are integrated into procurement workflows, and vendor security policies are standardized across the organization. A financial institution at this level may enforce third-party risk scoring models, periodic vendor security audits, and automated risk assessment tools, ensuring that vendors follow strict security policies and compliance requirements. At the adaptive tier, organizations employ real-time vendor security monitoring, AI-driven risk assessments, and dynamic supply chain security policies to continuously evaluate and mitigate third-party cyber risks. Supply chain security frameworks are automated, data-driven, and adaptive, ensuring that security teams identify and respond to third-party risks in real time. A global technology company at this level may use automated security scoring systems, blockchain-based supply chain verification, and predictive risk analytics to detect vendor security weaknesses before they are exploited by cybercriminals. Cybersecurity supply chain risk management aligns with multiple controls in the National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-53, ensuring that organizations implement comprehensive vendor security policies and risk assessment frameworks. One key control is SR-3 Supply Chain Risk Management Plan, which requires organizations to develop, document, and enforce structured supply chain security policies that define risk mitigation strategies, vendor security requirements, and third-party monitoring mechanisms. A healthcare provider implementing this control may require medical device manufacturers and cloud-based electronic health record providers to follow strict cybersecurity guidelines, including data encryption, access controls, and periodic security assessments. Another key control is SA-12 Supply Chain Protection, which mandates that organizations enforce security protections for all third-party software, hardware, and cloud-based services, ensuring that external vendors meet established cybersecurity standards. A financial institution implementing this control may require third-party payment processors, cloud storage providers, and outsourced service firms to comply with data encryption policies, multi-factor authentication requirements, and threat monitoring obligations to prevent unauthorized data exposure. Cybersecurity supply chain risk management also aligns with SR-7 Assessing Supply Chain Risk, which requires organizations to regularly evaluate third-party security risks, conduct vendor risk assessments, and monitor supplier compliance with cybersecurity policies. This control ensures that organizations proactively identify and mitigate potential security threats posed by vendors, contractors, and external service providers. A government contractor implementing this control may require all subcontractors to undergo cybersecurity audits, submit security certifications, and comply with contractual data protection requirements before being granted access to critical systems or classified information. These controls can be adapted based on organizational size, industry, and risk exposure. A small business may implement basic vendor security assessments, ensuring that suppliers follow industry-standard security practices and adhere to written security agreements. A large enterprise may deploy AI-driven vendor risk intelligence platforms, continuous third-party security monitoring, and automated supply chain security assessments to prevent cyber risks from propagating through external business relationships. Organizations in highly regulated industries, such as finance, healthcare, and government contracting, may require formal vendor security audits, third-party penetration testing, and contractual cybersecurity enforcement mechanisms to maintain compliance with industry cybersecurity frameworks and national security regulation. Auditors assess cybersecurity supply chain risk management by reviewing whether organizations have structured, documented, and continuously enforced vendor security policies and risk management frameworks. They evaluate whether organizations conduct third-party security assessments, enforce cybersecurity compliance requirements, and monitor supplier risk exposure in real time. If an organization fails to implement structured supply chain security practices, Auditors may issue findings highlighting vendor security gaps, insufficient third-party risk oversight, and failure to enforce security requirements in supplier contracts. To verify compliance, auditors seek specific types of evidence. Third-party risk assessment reports and vendor security questionnaires demonstrate that organizations formally evaluate the cybersecurity posture of suppliers before granting access to enterprise systems. Vendor security compliance records and contractual cybersecurity agreements provide insights into whether organizations enforce security policies, require vendors to follow security best practices, and implement contractual obligations for cybersecurity accountability. Supply chain risk intelligence reports and continuous vendor security monitoring logs show whether organizations proactively track third-party cyber risks, detect security incidents in vendor networks, and respond to emerging supply chain threats in real time. A compliance success scenario could involve a financial institution that undergoes an audit and provides evidence that vendor security risk management policies are fully implemented, with structured third-party risk assessments, continuous security monitoring, and contractual cybersecurity obligations enforced across all external business relationships. Auditors confirm that cybersecurity supply chain risks are effectively mitigated, third-party security compliance is continuously enforced, and vendor risk exposure is managed proactively. In contrast, an organization that fails to enforce third-party cybersecurity policies, neglects vendor risk assessments, or lacks continuous vendor security monitoring may receive audit findings for insufficient supply chain security governance, weak third-party risk oversight, and failure to prevent supply chain cyber threats. Organizations face multiple barriers in implementing effective cybersecurity supply chain risk management. One major challenge is limited visibility into third-party security postures, where organizations lack real-time insight into vendor cybersecurity risks, security incidents, and compliance status, increasing the risk of supply chain cyber attacks. Another challenge is inconsistent enforcement of vendor security policies, where different business units apply varying security requirements to suppliers, leading to gaps in cybersecurity enforcement and weak third-party risk governance. A final challenge is lack of automated vendor security monitoring, where organizations rely on periodic security audits instead of continuous third-party risk intelligence, making it difficult to detect and respond to emerging supply chain cyber threats in real time. Organizations can overcome these barriers by integrating cybersecurity supply chain risk management into procurement processes, enforcing contractual cybersecurity obligations, and implementing AI-driven vendor risk intelligence platforms. Investing in continuous third-party security monitoring, automated vendor risk scoring systems, and predictive supply chain threat modeling ensures that organizations proactively detect, assess, and mitigate cybersecurity risks introduced by external vendors and business partners. Standardizing vendor security policies across all third-party relationships, including cloud service providers, software developers, and manufacturing suppliers, ensures that cyber risks are consistently managed, reducing exposure to security threats and strengthening overall supply chain resilience. By embedding cybersecurity supply chain risk management into enterprise security governance, organizations enhance third-party security accountability, prevent cyber threats from infiltrating their networks, and maintain regulatory compliance in an evolving cyber threat landscape. That wraps up today's discussion on framework. Don't stop here. Head over to cyberauthor.me to explore more cybersecurity topics and discover a best-selling book covering NIST and other critical cyber frameworks. Please like, rate, and review this episode on Apple and Spotify. Until next time, remember that knowledge is power.